And on behalf of the faculty and staff of the College of Public and Allied Health, and on behalf of the Public Health Student Association, let me welcome all of you here this evening. I think most of you know that East Tennessee State University has made a commitment to create the first accredited college of public health in the state of Tennessee and the first in Central Appalachia. And I can't think of anyone better to celebrate that transition with than the nation's Surgeon General. Dr. Carmona served as the Surgeon General from 2002 to 2006 at a time of significant change in the country. He issued a number of reports, as do all Surgeon Generals, perhaps the most important of which is a report that's now reverberating in Nashville, and that is on secondhand smoke. He wrote the seminal report on that and the dangers associated with it. And as I mentioned, all Surgeon Generals are well known for the reports that they write, but I think this Surgeon General is going to be remembered for something else. And I think what he will be remembered for is the fact that he fundamentally changed the profession of public health in 4 years. Many people don't remember that before 2002, there was a significant debate in this country about whether bioterrorism, disaster preparedness, and emergency planning really belonged in public health or not. This Surgeon General, through his leadership, through his personal professional experience, and through his guidance, has changed that. Today, we all recognize that an infectious disease moving through our country is a public health priority, whether it got here because of social behavior, whether it got here because a bird flew over from another continent, or whether it got here through the malicious act of a terrorist. We all recognize that a disaster is a public health emergency, whether it's man-made or natural. And that has come through the leadership of Dr. Richard Carmona. I had the opportunity to visit with Dr. Carmona shortly after Katrina and Rita struck. We visited his command center there in the Humphrey building. And while there have been many criticisms of the nation's response to the hurricanes, the one area where there has been no criticism was the exemplary performance of the Public Health Service. It was very clear that he was the Surgeon General. He was the man in charge. He was the right man at the right time. The nation is better off today because of it, and our profession is stronger. So please join me in welcoming the Honorable Dr. Richard Carmona, the 17th Surgeon General of the United States.
Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for allowing me to come and visit with you tonight. It was a good excuse to see my old friend and colleague, Randy Wyckoff, who I don't know how many of you really know Randy yet, but you are extraordinarily lucky to have such a wonderful leader, knowledgeable leader, a credible leader, not only nationally, but known internationally. And I'll give you just one vignette real quickly. As I was driving in, and Randy picked me up at the airport, I was being paged by my predecessor, David Satcher, who was a 16th Surgeon General of the United States. And David and I are still working on a number of projects together. And I said to David, "Oh, David, I'm at East Tennessee tonight. Randy Wyckoff just picked me up. I'm going to be a visiting prof for a day and catch up with Randy." And David, silent for a second, he said, "Richard, that is the finest public health official I've ever worked with as Surgeon General." And I said to him, I agree, that's why I'm here. And my only regret as Surgeon General is that Randy didn't stay around long enough so that I could have tapped into the great wisdom and leadership that he had. He left early in his career in my career because of opportunities after having served 17 years in the federal government in various capacities. But as chief at the Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion, I mean, he was a powerhouse. I mean, he really was the government's lead person in understanding the issues of disease promotion and health, disease prevention and health promotion. And I was at a loss for a while when he left, and we had to fill a bunch of gaps, but which really never could be. But he always remained a friend and a consultant. When I needed something, he was always there. I'd like to tell you a few things tonight. I'll tell you a little bit about about myself and how I came to the office of Surgeon General, and because I think that's a foreign path for most people. And then tell you a little bit about the portfolio I had as Surgeon General and some of the issues that are still facing our nation today that all of you, I'm sure, are aware of, and especially the students need to be aware of, because as I came in, one of the reporters was asking me about what's the message you want to give to the youngsters who are going to be in this school that's forming, and why is public health important? And I said, well, I struggled for the 10 seconds I had before I walked in here. She asked me the question. But public health is really the foundation of everything. If you don't have health, you have nothing. It doesn't make a difference if you're wealthy or where you are in the world if you don't have health. And as I see it, there's a huge demand for public health professionals today, whether you're a doctor, a nurse, a dentist, or any health profession that has an additional core competency in public health. There are many opportunities for you to serve at a local, state, or a federal level. So when you look at it as it relates to the workforce in the future, there's extraordinary opportunities for you. And the most important thing to me has been you really have a unique position where you have the opportunity to change the lives of your fellow citizens. You know, as a clinical doctor, you do one-on-one. You take care of a single person that has a chief complaint. As a public health official, you take care of populations. And you can really change the health status of communities from local up till international. So let me tell you about my journey here. Now, as many of you probably know, you can't apply for the job of Surgeon General. The President of the United States gets to select you. Congress, the Senate, gets to either say you're okay or not, confirm you. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background because it weighs heavily in how I see health. And I will tell you right up front that many of the lessons that I learned as a child growing up were equally, if not more important, than the lessons I learned later after several degrees. I was born in New York City, and I'm an immigrant kid. My parents were the first to come with my grandparents. My grandmother came with 27 children and no money and settled in a tenement in Harlem. And my father's generation, all of my aunts and uncles, none of them were highly educated. A few had finished high school, most did not. And most of the family members worked in some kind of labor. My aunts worked as caregivers and housekeepers, cleaning, pressing clothes. My uncles did labor. But they came to the country to appreciate the opportunity that this nation has that many other nations don't have. And in fact, although they never made a lot of money, they all improved their lot in life. They all got a job, they all became tax-paying citizens, they all got their own apartments, and even one of my uncles bought a car years later. And we never had a car growing up. My parents struggled. My mother was an only child without a father. And you'll see the reason I'm telling you this, because these are the social cycles that interplay with the public's health. And having experienced them gives me a lot more passion for public health than just having a degree. My parents struggled not only economically, but they had problems with substance abuse. And I was the oldest of 4 children, so I became a surrogate parent. At 6 years old, we were homeless. We were living in the streets. My grandmother took us into a small tenement that she lived in, and then she was able to move to the projects, which is subsidized housing. But 12 of us lived in an apartment about as big as this stage for a year and a half, until my parents could get on their feet again, and we got another tenement apartment in Harlem. The apartment I grew up in was roach-infested, mice-infested. There's no cooling, forget about cooling, and there was never enough hot water or cold water, and it was just a place to live. The life I remember, though, was really a good one. We were happy kids. We didn't have a whole lot. The neighborhood I grew up in, almost all brown and black faces. There was hardly any Anglos there. It was pretty much what you call a minority community. And so I grew up being colorblind because I never really differentiated anybody from me that lived in the neighborhood because we were just all poor kids. Parents were not responsible for the kids' extracurricular activities because usually they weren't there. You wanted to play, you just went out in the street and you played. We all learned to swim in the Harlem River or the Hudson, depending on which side of the city you were on. For me, it was the Harlem River. My grandmother made the sacrifice to come to the country because she wanted her grandkids to appreciate all that the nation had. Knew it would not be so impactful on her kids, but on her grandkids. Unfortunately, my two brothers, my sister, and I all let them down because we got caught up in the usual social things and didn't pay attention to school. But again, when you're not sure if you're going to eat at night, when you're not sure where your next meal's coming from, where there's instability in the family, then education becomes less important to most kids because you're just trying to survive. And those are lessons I learned personally, not academically. Although now, with the academic education, I can certainly expand and expound on the variables that contribute to these socioeconomic inequities. But having experienced them gives you an unusual insight. And not only an insight, but as I used to tell my colleagues in Washington, it sensitizes you to the plight of the common man and woman who are trying to raise a family. And I used to tell my staff, not only does it sensitize me, but in fact, I'm biased. I'm biased. And wherever I have to make a decision where I'm going to have to favor somebody, I'm always going to favor the poor guy that struggled. And that was the bias I brought from coming up in that type of environment. But most of what I remember was pretty positive. We were happy kids. We didn't take vacations. Nobody had a car. But life was not so bad. For me, the emancipating moment was after being a truant for many years and dropping out of high school. And my two brothers, my sister, and I never finished high school. I had about a 9th grade education. Not really. I mean, I went to 9th, 10th grade, but I didn't really finish. By the time I got to be a senior in high school, I'd been asked to leave a few times. And by the time I left in senior year, I was really still a freshman. My two brothers and my sister the same. And so my mother, we disappointed her because my mother, although she was a very courageous woman and maybe what I call a Renaissance woman before her time, very intelligent, and even though we didn't have any money, she'd go to the library and get books and bring them home, and she'd read to us, and she'd try and teach us other languages, and she'd try and tell us about the world and how important it was, and tell us we didn't have to live that way. Education would set us free. My father was a street guy, good guy, kind, caring, and loving, but he had a different life, and we didn't see him that much. So my mom was kind of a single parent before that term was characterized. My mom many nights would cry herself to sleep because she'd say, I just want to live long enough to see one of my children graduate. And she only meant high school because nobody had finished high school. That was the goal, get one kid out of high school. So none of us made it the first pass, but years later, we all eventually made it. At 17, with not a lot to do, I enlisted in the Army because I ran into an Army Special Forces guy who I didn't know, but befriended me and brings into the importance of mentorship in a young man or woman's life. Told me the same things my mother had told me and my grandmother had told me my whole life, but I didn't listen to them. But he did my reality check and told me I should go back to school. I was 17, I told him I was too old, I couldn't. So I went and spoke to his friend who was an Army recruiter. And of course the Army recruiter was happy to see me. It was 1967. He said, come on in, son, we're going to make you all you can be. Oh, that's it. And had me take some tests. And he said, Carmona, you're a pretty smart guy. You're going to do just fine. And if you'll just sign this paper, we'll take care of you. And I did. And it was probably the best signature I put on the paper. It took me out of the environment. And for once I was being challenged. I was being held accountable. And I actually enjoyed it. I appreciated parts of me that I never was able to appreciate because of the environment I grew up in. I was a lot stronger than I thought. I wasn't as smart as I thought, but I came to grips with that because I realized early on that, God doesn't give everything to everybody. I had average intelligence, but I had a lot of tenacity and perseverance. And learning that early on serves you well in life because you need to know your limitations as well as your strengths. So I went in the Army fully thinking I was going to make a career out of it because I found another family. I had 3 squares. I had place to live. I saw the world. I went to Vietnam. I lost some of my best friends there in combat. I was wounded myself. I came back just shy of my 21st birthday, but probably with the maturity of about a 40-year-old man, having seen what real social inequities were, what real poverty was, traveling the world, and recognizing that as poor as we may have been in the United States, we were still a whole lot better than most places I had visited as a soldier. I tried to get into college, but I couldn't because my colleagues, I wasn't sure if they were trying to get rid of me or really wanted me to go to college, but everybody was encouraging me to go to college, and I tried to get in, but I couldn't get in because I didn't have SATs or PSATs. But the City University of New York, Bronx Community College had an open enrollment program, and I got in the back door. And I worked full-time. I've had many jobs. There wasn't a lot of financial aid, nor would anybody invest in me, and I wouldn't expect them to invest in me at that point in my life because there really wasn't any tangible evidence of potential success. So I worked as a police officer, a paramedic, a registered nurse, physician's assistant, teacher. I did a lot of different jobs, usually 2 at a time, going to school full-time. I became an A student, not because I was the smartest kid in the class, but because I was the most focused and I was the most disciplined kid in the class. And I had to get up a little earlier, stay up a little later, but I got my A's. I became an A student, eventually went to the 4-year school, transferred to California, graduated at the top of my class. I got fortunate I got into medical school. And in medical school I did the best in my life because there wasn't a day that went by that I wasn't ecstatic about being there. And I always had this sense of enjoyment. It's not even the right adjective, but it was a sense that I had really snuck in and I didn't belong there. And even the kids I grew up with used to joke that someday they're going to catch Richie Carmona and send him back to the block because he escaped. And in medical school, I was one of those who volunteered for every rotation that nobody else wanted. A lot of people didn't want to work at the county hospital because it was kind of dark and dingy and there were lots of poor people. I wanted to be at the county hospital because I felt very much at home there. But I volunteered at the university hospital as well as the VA and all the other places we trained at. I did very, very well, and unbeknownst to me not trying, I skipped my last year of medical school, and then I graduated #1 in my class. Not because I was the smartest, I was just the happiest kid in the class, and I couldn't believe I was there, and I just enjoyed myself so much. And then my colleagues will tell me my first downfall, I trained in surgery. I'm happy to admit I'm a recovering surgeon. And I went into public health as a second career. So I trained as a general vascular surgeon. I subspecialized in trauma, burns, and critical care. I ran EMS systems and trauma systems, and I thought I'd do that the rest of my life. But that wasn't to be either. Because as I started in my career, a young assistant professor, and after a few years, and I'm training interns and residents and fellows, and I started realizing most of the stuff I'm taking care of is preventable. And I started thinking about it, and on any given day, 2 or 3 out of every 4 patients I admitted didn't have to be there. They were crashing their cars, drunk drivers, domestic violence, on and on and on. The list is endless. And so I broke it into 2 categories. There were people that made bad decisions that day. Like I said, a drunk driver, domestic violence, and so on, crimes, drug use. And then there were people that made bad decisions their whole life. Sedentary lifestyle, no physical activity, smoking, drinking excessively. And I started to see this picture emerging that I'm a very busy, successful surgeon, but really it's because of the poor behaviors of others. And I started becoming cynical toward the end of my clinical career, where I would tell my fellows and residents, I said, I'm not really a trauma surgeon. I'm a repairer of society's indiscretions. I put people back together that make bad decisions. And either they made them that day, or they make them their whole life. But they come before you on that journey, and they have a heart attack, or a stroke, or an aneurysm, or a gunshot wound, or a car crash. And if you show up with a pulse, we could probably save you. But are we saving you from yourself? Are you going to go out and repeat those same behaviors and become part of a disease burden that continues to mount in this country? That's at about 16% of our gross national product right now. So that's what drove me more into prevention. And as a trauma surgeon, I started doing a lot of prevention work, seat belts, helmets, pool safety, DUI stuff. I mean, the list was endless. And about that time, I said, I'm going to go back to school and get a master's. And I was working as a professor, and I went to night school for 3 years, and I got my master's in public health policy and administration. Not because I wanted to be Surgeon General, just because I thought I needed more information, I needed more education. Plus, medicine was changing, DRGs were coming in, life was getting very complicated, building and so on. And so I thought I needed more education. But slowly I started gravitating more and more to public health, and I was asked to be the interim CEO of the county hospital. I didn't want to do it, but I said, okay, I'll do it for a year until you find a CEO and I'll help you. Well, 2 years later, they really weren't looking that hard. We turned the county hospital around. One of the few in the country that started making some money. They asked me to take over the entire county healthcare system, which was Medicare, Medicaid, home health agencies, EMS, the 911 system, nursing homes, and I was foolish enough to say yes. I did. And so 4 years later, now I'm CEO of this health corporation, and something I never planned to do, and I'm less than 5% of my time is clinical. I crossed over, as my clinical colleagues told me, and became one of them, running a health system. And then a little over 5 years ago, late one night, I had stayed very much involved with our EMS system, police and fire, EMS training, teaching courses, doing a lot of prevention work. I ran the public health office, was under me. And a little over 5 years ago, I get this call, and it says, Dr. Carmona, it's an 8th voicemail, I still remember, late one night. It says, Dr. Carmona, he gives his name from White House personnel. Would you please give us a call about a job? And I hung up and I started laughing because I thought, these cops and firemen I work with will stop at nothing to embarrass me. Why would the White House be calling me? I had no political ties. I didn't run in those circles. So I looked at the caller ID, and it was a 202 area code with a 456 prefix. And now I know that's the White House because I've had it on speed dial for almost 5 years, but I didn't know it then. So I called the next day, and the young man said, oh, sir, yes. And 10 minutes, he talked to me about how great it would be to come to Washington, and I started worrying about his sanity. And he said, talk. And then I said, well, what's this all about? He says, oh, well, the president's going to announce this week that he's recruiting for a new United States Surgeon General. Would you be interested? So I remember I'm holding the phone, and I'm laughing, and I'm thinking, well, this surely means there's another Rich Carmona in the country. They got the wrong one. But I thought, there's no downside. I'm a smart street kid. I'm gainfully employed. I'll tell them yes. I'll get a few free trips to Washington. They'll find out it isn't me. They'll send me home. I'll have my job. It's not a big deal. So I said, all right. So I said, sure. I'll apply. What do you want me to do? So they gave me the information, and I applied electronically first. And then I started having telephonic interviews. And after about the second or third, there were about 2 a week at times. And this was one of the fastest Surgeon General confirmations in history. After about the second or third call, I recognized that one of these calls is going to be the one where they're going to say, well, Dr. Carmona, you're a wonderful community servant. You've been a great doctor. You've served your country. You've been in the Army, Special Forces. But we're going to select Dr. A, B, or C, and don't feel bad. So what I did was I had this 3x5 card that I wrote out, and I wrote out my rejection speech with dignity. Because I knew they were going to call me and tell me, it's not you. Because why would they pick me? As one congressman who, from my state, who I knew when I went to, and I asked him to give me some advice, and he said, sure. I'd always helped him with his stuff, and I said, I need some advice now. And I went in, and I had trouble describing to him what it was that I was being considered for. And he said, well, Rich, out with it. What is it? And I said, well, Surgeon General of the United States. He started to laugh. And I said, well, Congressman, I'm here for support, And he said, okay. So he said, Rich, I had a piece of paper in front of him. He said, do you belong to the party? And I said, which party? He shook his head. He said, do you make large donations? Are you a ranger? I said, when I was in the Army, I was a ranger. He said, no, the guys that give a lot of money to the party. I said, no. He said, do you know anybody in the cabinet or something? Do you know the president? I said, no. I said, but you know what? When I was in Vietnam in 1969-70, Colin Powell was a major about 100 miles from me with the Americal Division. And he said, that ain't going to help you. So his parting remarks to me were, he says, Rich, do you play the lottery? I said, nah, not much. He says, well, you ought to because you got a I said, I understand, Congressman. I mean, it's a long shot, but what have I got to lose? I'm going to go through this process. So the calls kept coming in for a couple of weeks. I take out the card, I put it away, and then I get a call, and they start inviting me to Washington. I start interviewing very famous people that you read about every day, and I started to worry then, because I thought, if I snuck through this far, did I really want to work in this system? And then I'm going to tell you exactly how this happened. I got a call. It was 5 years ago, a little more than 5 now, and a very highly placed source at the White House. And phone rings. He identifies himself. I take out the card. I put it down. He said, "This is it." He says, "Dr. Carmona, we'd like to know what you're doing on March 26th." And as I started to answer, he said, "We really want to know what your children are doing." I thought, oh, God, they're going to interview my kids. I'm screwed. I'll never get a job. So as I started to answer again, he said, "Dr. Carmona, sorry, I should have told you right up front. We'd like to know what you and your family are doing on March 26th. We just left a meeting with the President. He's made his decision. He wants to nominate you as the next United States Surgeon General." And I said, "You're shitting me." And he said, "No, sir, I'm not." So I called my wife and I said, "Go over all of that curtsying and handshake and stuff with the kids pretty quick and get clean underwear and do all that stuff. And we're going to Washington." And we went. Your life changes pretty quickly. You become a public figure overnight. Everything you say and do is a matter of public record. Still get goosebumps thinking about going into the Oval Office, meeting the President, having your family come in, taking pictures, and like, just it's surrealistic still today, 5 years later. And then we walk out and you go into the green room and the press is there from the whole world, the cabinet is there, and you get introduced as the nominee for Surgeon General, and your life changes forever. Because now everything you say and do is a matter of public record. And people start looking at you. And you're starting to feel good. Okay, I'm done. When do I start work? But you realize there's a second part of this, and it's called confirmation. You have to go before the U.S. Senate. And for those of you who are physicians, it's like taking your boards in public. That's what confirmation is like. And you come to realize as you interview individually with all the senators over the next couple of months that they have your life in their hands. They can make you look like a Nobel laureate, or they can make you look like an abject failure. And so as I moved through all of those interviews and then got scheduled for the Senate confirmation, here's your whole life, your whole career is on the line. You actually, as you become more of a public figure, and the press picks up on you, and you end up being on what they call a short list. They never tell you what that short list is, but it confers an unearned credibility that you're on the short list. You must be important, because there's only a few of you left, of several hundred that were being considered. But that also puts a target on your back. And it's a very difficult process because it's always intrusive, but often it is malicious. And you get attacked. You get implicated in crimes you weren't even in the state, but your name somehow gets linked to something. Then you come out, you go for your Senate confirmation. And on the day I went up to the Senate, I was in the anteroom, and a very senior senator came out to greet me. And I had met all the senators already individually, but now I'm going before the Senate. And this could take an hour, or it could take 8 days. They hold you as long as they want until they've done their due diligence. The senator, who was a very senior senator who had befriended me, came out, wished me well before I went in, and he said, "You're going to do fine." He said, "Just answer the questions honestly the way you have. We're going to have to ask you some very tough questions because we have to do our due diligence. The public is watching us. This is a very important position. And as you know, there are different opinions up here on the Hill about who should have this position. Just be a straight shooter like you were. Tell us the answers as you did and you'll be fine. But make no mistake, we're going to have to ask you some very, very difficult questions." I said, "Thank you, Senator, I appreciate it." He started walking away and then he came back to me. And he said, "But I want to tell you one more thing, Rich." He said, I'm fairly certain you're going to do well and you will be our next U.S. Surgeon General. So I want to give you some advice. You won't understand it now, but just remember what I tell you. You've probably heard this before, but in the context of being here on the Hill, nobody can understand it until you've lived this. So what is it, Senator? He said, when you come to Washington, if you want a friend, you bring a dog. And I said, Senator, I think I've heard that before. I think it was President Truman that said it, but thanks, and I'm cognizant now. I'll probably figure it out. About 3 years after, I happened to be on the Hill and one of many testimonies that the Surgeon General has to go up to do. And I ran into the Senator, and we exchanged niceties, and asked me how I was, I asked him how he was. And I said, Senator, do you remember how kind you were to me when I was being confirmed, and you gave me some advice? And he stopped and he smiled and he said, about the dog. I said, yes, Senator. And he said, you do understand now. I said, yes, Senator, but respectfully, I disagree. And he said, why? I said, well, Senator, I've come to realize through my own experience that when you come to Washington, you need to bring 2 dogs. And he said, well, why, Rich? I said, because during your tenure, one of those dogs will turn on you. And the Senator's smile turned into a laugh, and he said, may I quote you from now on? You may. So that's the path to being Surgeon General, a piece of cake. Nothing you could ever expect, but any one of you youngsters here in the graduate program in 10, 15, 20 years could be in that position because it's that fortuitous. Nobody can apply for it. It's just out of the blue. But then, after the aura fades, and you start to think, okay, I'm Surgeon General, the clock's ticking. What do I do now? What is my portfolio? What is the legacy that I'm going to continue being the 17th Surgeon General of the United States that builds on the rich and robust, over 200-year legacy of the U.S. Public Health Service and its Surgeon Generals? Because the U.S. Public Health Service was here at the beginning of this country. It's one of 7 uniformed services of the United States. President Adams signed the act for the Marine Hospital Service in 1798, and that's where the supervising surgeon came from, and the Marine Hospital Service. One of our public health officers is right here, the only one for about 100 miles, I think, right, Commander? Is that correct? And they serve, our public health officers serve in 800 locations around the world, and what they have in common is selfless dedication to duty. They serve in all places where there's no market for health professionals. 800 locations in the world, and some of the most desolate places in the world, including national responsibility for the Bureau of Prisons, for immigration, health, many other areas that you haven't heard of that nobody wants to provide any care because they're very difficult. Plus CDC, NIH, HRSA, SAMHSA, all of those other places as well. So I recognized that I was really going to have to work hard because this is an extraordinary tradition that's a couple of centuries old. And my predecessor and good friend David Satcher did an extraordinary job, and before him Chick Coop and Tony Novello and the others, and I thought, boy, this is going to be tough. But the portfolio had to be based on science, can't be based on politics. And so as I looked at my evidence base, I said it's pretty clear what we need to do as a nation. The first thing we have to embrace is prevention. Why? For the reasons I told you already. I see what the cost of care is, what the disease burden is because of poor behaviors on people's part, because of the socioeconomic disparities that occur. And in fact, to this day, the greatest indicator of health status in this country and the world is socioeconomic status. So whether you're in Zambia or whether you're right here in East Tennessee, socioeconomic status is your biggest clue as to what somebody's health status is. And so I started drawing on my personal experiences as a kid, as a health professional that was growing, eventually a doc, a trauma surgeon, a professor. And I thought, it's got to be prevention. 16% of our gross national products being spent on health care. Most of it's preventable. 70 to 80% of what we spend our healthcare dollars on is preventable. And that's about $2.4 trillion a year, and expected to go over 20% within a decade to about $4.8 trillion, with a T, trillion. So the legacy that we'll leave you youngsters is unsustainable. The disease burden and economic burden will be one you can't afford. So as the leaders argue about the healthcare crisis, and usually think about it, the arguments you hear is always about who pays. Cost sharing, Medicare, Medicaid, states cost sharing with the feds, and so on. How often do you hear, if ever, a discussion about how do you eliminate the disease burden? Because you know what? It's all a shell game. There's no way that we're going to continue to be able to pay for health care the way we're going. The only solution is to embrace prevention. Because through prevention, you have the potential of eliminating 70–80% of what we pay for, and thereby reducing the cost of care, making more money available for those who really need the care, the 50 million who are uninsured now, that go around that revolving door. In doing so, we reduce the cost of care, we improve longevity and quality of life. So there are some tangential benefits as well. So prevention had to be number one. The second was preparedness. Nation at war, a nation challenged by not only the war, but terrorism, the tools of the terrorists, the weapons of mass destruction, conventional weapons of mass destruction, which are bombs and bullets and fire, and unconventional weapons of mass destruction, or specialized weapons of mass destruction, which are nuclear and biological and chemical. All of those are foreign to our citizens. So it's a new world order. So having to train not only our first responders and our health professionals to this new world order, how to prevent either man-made or naturally occurring disasters from occurring. And if we can't prevent, how do we quickly respond competently and professionally? And once we respond and do what we can to save lives, then the next step is how do we mitigate the damage? And then how do we recover from that damage? That's the continuum in public health. So it's a new world order. So preparedness became something high on my radar screen, and it was something, of course, I was comfortable with, having worked the streets as a first responder, both as a police officer and a paramedic, having trained paramedics and EMTs and rescued people my whole life, having been a trauma surgeon and running EMS systems. It was an environment I was very comfortable with. So prevention, preparedness. The third area that I thought we really needed to do something about was the issue of health disparities. We are a nation that's still divided by our health care stats, metrics of health. What do I mean by that? Martin Luther King put it this way a few decades ago. Now, I'm only going to paraphrase him, but he said something to the effect that the evil twin of racial discrimination is health discrimination. And health discrimination still exists in this nation. If you are a so-called minority, if you are in one of the socioeconomic underclasses, you are most likely health disparate. You have a disproportionate disease burden within your particular community because of that. African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and the greatest health disparities that we see in this nation are in Native Americans. When I was teaching in the University of Arizona, and graduate students would come to me at the end of their training and say, Dr. Carmona, we want to go to, and they name a third world country, because we want to apply our public health knowledge now. They said they wanted to go to Africa or the Americas, and they want to bring clean water and sanitation to communities. They want to immunize children. They want to sanitize the food. They want to get rid of all that's preventable. I said, that's wonderful. How much is that going to cost? And they said, well, I'm going to get a grant, this, and that. I said, that's great. I said, let me ask you a question. Why don't you just go down the road to the Tohono O'odham Reservation, or the Pascoyaki Reservation, or the Navajo Reservation? Forget you're in the United States. Those are third world countries within our nation. My public health officers who oversee the Indian Health Service have a 2 to 3 year backlog just to bring clean water and sanitation to some Indian villages in this nation. That's a disgrace. It's been estimated that for every $7 we spend on a Medicare patient, we spend 1 on an Indian. And then you say, well, gee, how come it's so bad there? Well, let me think about it. Look at the history. You know, this was their land before we came. Think about the metrics, too. In 1900, at the turn of the last century, the average American was living 48, 50 years. Indians were living into their 70s. They didn't have obesity, hunter-gatherers. Their society kept them robust, and bartering. They had their tensions among the different tribes, but they had a rich and robust culture that predated us. We came, we robbed their culture. We robbed their way of life. We put them on the most desolate land that this country can find, created what we call reservations, promised them health care, which was only partially delivered. There were many broken promises and half-fulfilled treaties. So we shouldn't be surprised as a nation that we're losing a whole culture. That the life expectancy in some reservations is 10 or 20 years less than the average American. That suicide rates are unprecedented. No place in the country do you see clusters of suicides like they do on the Indian reservations. That infectious disease, that maternal child health, that unemployment, that high school dropouts, all of the metrics are of the lowest. And that's right here within our borders. These are American citizens in sovereign nations that we call reservations. So I said we need to do something about that. So prevention, preparedness, health disparities. And I made a commitment personally because I said, you know, one of the things that the Surgeon General can do best is to give a voice to those populations who cry out often for help, but because they don't have lobbyists or advocates, nobody hears them. So I did spend a lot of my time on health disparities. I spent time on the health of persons with disabilities. I published the first Surgeon General's report on the health of people with disabilities, because often we see people with disabilities as not able to do things, when really they are able people who have some problem. But as evidenced by the Special Olympics, as evidenced by, you know, the regular Olympics, I mean, all of these things that we see so-called disabled people doing, we need to focus on the health status rather than just that they have some disability. So those things made me very proud. But to be successful with prevention, preparedness, and health disparities, it was clear that we needed another vehicle. And that vehicle is what I call health literacy. We are largely a health illiterate nation. 90 million people, almost a third of our population, are health illiterate. They do not equate their behaviors to the health outcomes. They don't know why they take certain medicines, only that a doctor told them to take the medicine. They don't understand why they're coming back for a clinic appointment, and sometimes they don't show up. And we call that, in the medical profession, we say, darn, patient is non-compliant, didn't listen. But the literature will tell you that most non-compliance is actually you didn't do a well enough job of explaining what the issues and problems were. And that's proven in the literature. So we have to accept some of that responsibility for perpetuating health disparities, even when we do make an attempt, and recognize that health illiteracy is a problem. Health literacy is a common currency that can help us be successful with prevention, preparedness, and health disparities. So that's where I spent most of my time as Surgeon General. Another area that I developed, I don't want to say I did, but I pushed. It was out there, but there wasn't a lot of political will for it, is the area of global health and health diplomacy. One of the greatest unleveraged powers of this nation is its export of health. And I'll relate it to the current war on terrorism. I'm a soldier. I've served for 3 generations. Carmonas have been in war. My son served in Iraq as well. So I say this as a patriot, not as somebody that's against the war. But what I see is that there's a tremendous power that we have in this nation that can bring peace and stability to some unstable parts of the world. And we've proven it already through military, humanitarian assistance programs, so-called health diplomacy. And one of the things that I started to try and push with understanding of global health. And global health simply is that challenges and threats before us don't recognize our geopolitical borders. Whether it's emerging infections, AIDS, SARS, mad cow, whatever, or whether it's a terrorist event. Geopolitical borders are immaterial in public health. Pretend they're not there when you're looking at public health. And then all health really does become global. Your common flu that you deal with every year doesn't start in the United States. It starts overseas and works its way here over a year, and 35,000 people a year die in the United States from it, and nobody blinks an eye. And many people still don't get immunized. So globalness is important in public health. Health diplomacy is a tool that can help the following way. And I'll give you a tangible example. When the tsunamis hit in Indonesia being largely a Muslim country, and we tried to go there and provide military assistance. In fact, we launched one of the hospital ships there with Peace Corps, USAID, public health officers. And the government didn't want to let us in. They didn't trust us. We were those guys. We were those infidels. they saw the world differently. We had to negotiate to allow our officers from public health to go on land for a couple of hours a day, and people were dying. Villages were destroyed, and all we wanted to do was help. Because of the cultural barrier, we couldn't. Our officers of the U.S. Public Health Service, who are some of the best practitioners of cultural competence, that is taking the best science and translating it to diverse populations that we have the privilege to serve in order to change behavior. They kept pushing. So at first days, a couple hours, next days, a couple hours. After a few weeks, they're actually in the village. They're allowed to stay overnight. And what you saw there was the practice of health diplomacy. One of the Navy admirals who was entrenched in the war effort, and many of my colleagues who were directly responsible for the war effort, started coming to the realization that you probably can't impose democracy on another country. You're probably not going to be able to do this as a force. Are there other tools that we can use? And much to his credit, the Navy admiral who was in charge of the entire Pacific said, after witnessing what happened in Indonesia and in Pakistan with our Armed Forces Uniform Services, said, probably the greatest improvement that we've had in extinguishing terrorism in the last several decades has been these type of humanitarian assistance programs. Because they don't only deliver health, what they do is break down asymmetries that lead to the genesis of terrorism. Terrorism flourishes where there's poor leadership, where there's asymmetries of health, of wealth, of ideology, and theology. When you can go into a country and have them see the true American, bring health, which gives hope, which gives prosperity. In that short month that our officers got there as aliens, when it was time for them to leave, they were at a point where the villagers didn't want them to leave. They wanted them to stay. They had become part of the family. And to this day, our officers still get emails and mailings and presents from those folks because they see a different American now. So one of the great powerful tools of public health to be leveraged, to be exported, is this concept of health diplomacy within global health. That's not the only solution. We still need a strong military. But my argument is that it is unleveraged, and we need to do more of that to sustain not only our image within the world, but really because there's no other humanitarian nation like we. We take care, we are the world's policemen. We are the world's health giver. We are the ones that reach out. We just need to use it a little bit more effectively so that there is some tangential benefit to extinguish those asymmetries and hopefully not have to deal with such divisiveness. On the other side of health diplomacy, there's an adversary that's practicing health diplomacy right now in the Americas. Watch Fidel Castro, watch Hugo Chavez. Fidel is exporting his medics, nurses, docs to Latin American countries, and he's creating alliances there. Maybe our next hotbed. But he's figured out how powerful a little island 90 miles off the coast of the United States can be in uniting a divided Americas against us on some issues. And if we're not careful, he'll be more successful in practicing his health diplomacy than we are. So there are huge implications to the application of public health. It's not just being in a public health department in your community, but you look locally, you look state, you look national and international. Power of public health is there. It's an extraordinary power that we have unleveraged, but it's an extraordinary opportunity for all of you young men and women who are considering your career because there's no end to where you can be. Our public health officers serve in the State Department, at CDC, NIH, and around the world. So you can pick almost any discipline you want, and you can be a hero out there changing the world. For me, when I first came in as Surgeon General, my thought was that I was going to stamp out disease and famine and pestilence and change the world and have great legislation named after me. And then I recognized that wasn't going to be. As Randy will tell you, things don't move at the speed we'd like them to in Washington. It's very complex. In fact, it's a combat zone. And you survive because there are great mentors and friends like Randy, like the Surgeon Generals who came before me, who taught me how to stay out of trouble while expressing my passion for the public's health. If not, you end your career real quick because Washington is very, very unforgiving. So as I started to understand that more, I realized the metrics of my success or failure were going to be different. It wasn't going to be about sweeping changes. It was going to be about incrementalism. It was going to be about small changes over time that need to be sustained, and tenacity and perseverance were going to be important if the issue was important. Lessons I learned as a child, that I failed many more times in my life, even to today, than I succeeded. But what I learned was the only difference between the person that succeeds and fails is the one that succeeds gets up one more time. And if it's important, you just keep getting up. And you have to learn that in Washington, otherwise you'll get nothing done. But I recognized that my preconceived notions of these great things I was going to do wasn't going to happen. It was going to be about incrementalism. It was going to be about protecting the dignity and integrity of the office of the Surgeon General, because the politicians don't own that office. The people own that office. And it is the most visible, credible position in the government. You think about it. The President is more visible, State Department, DOD. There's a lot of people that are more visible. But nobody has visibility and credibility like the Surgeon General. When the Surgeon General speaks on behalf of the nation, nobody questions partisanship. They go, oh, that's the Surgeon General. He said this, we shouldn't do it. Or we should do that. When public officials who are elected speak, it's always partisan. Oh, that's a Democrat. Oh, that's a Republican, And you're partisan. That's the power of being at the bully pulpit. That the Surgeon General speaks for the science and the health that the nation needs to know in a nonpartisan way. Staying above the political fray is where you have to be. And my predecessors have all done that. And that was my challenge, to be able to honor the dignity and integrity they brought to the office and be able to perpetuate it and have some successes that show that the office is in better shape than when I received it. That was my goal. So when I left, I recognized that first and foremost, the metrics for my success, as I saw them, were as follows. That one, that the President of the United States and the U.S. Senate, who took a chance on an unknown person to serve in this most important position, would have their faith reaffirmed, that they took a chance on the right person, and I served in this office with dignity and integrity. That the people of the United States who I served as the doctor of the nation, and the morphed position to a global position now as Surgeon General, that the people saw me as the doctor of the nation and trusted what I said, and I stayed above the political fray, and they saw my remarks as always being for their best interest and not partisan in any way, and that I served them with dignity and integrity. And last but not least, that the world I served recognized that I saw the importance and the power in global health and health diplomacy, that I understood, and more than understood, embraced diversity and globalness, and that I served them with dignity and integrity also, and always, always look globally in all of my decisions and all of my opinions, because I recognized that I was just part of a much larger world that I was contributing to. Thanks very much.